Today we're going to talk about ignorance. Before her bedtime, we wrap our 1-year-old in a sleep sack. It's basically a sort of a light, wearable blanket thingy that keeps her warm. It stays in her body throughout the night. But for me, sleep sacks are a little bit difficult to navigate, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm left-handed, and it has a zipper that especially goes top down. So just like jackets and other zippers, I have just slightly more problems than right-handers do. Zippers seem to be kind of designed for right-handed people, which is expected because they're the majority of the population. But when I first told my right-handed wife of my travails with the sleep sack, she literally didn't get it. Oh, you just start from the top and take the zipper and put the two sides together and pull it down. Like, thanks, but I know that. My problem isn't that I don't know how to do it, but that doing this is a little bit more difficult for me than it is for you. Once I explained my trouble with the zipper, I think my wife understood it, but she'll never understand it in the same way I understand it. She'll never actually experience having those problems with a zipper. This is a good, if trivial, example of what we might call the problem of ignorance and asymmetrical knowledge. The idea that different people who have different vantage points on the world might see some things we clearly can't see or interpret the same things very differently, and vice versa. In philosophy, this concern for standpoint can also be called standpoint epistemology, literally knowledge that's dependent on standpoint. Usually when we think of knowledge, we think of it as sort of standpoint neutral or irrelevant, and in a lot of cases that works well enough. 2 plus 2 is a well-worn example of knowledge we see as just knowledge. It doesn't depend on a person's perspective. And if someone comes to us and says, from my perspective, 2 plus 2 is 7, we'll probably say to them, well, you just don't understand math. Let me sit down and explain it to you. But what about knowledge, say, about whether certain sets of rules or certain institutions are fair or just, or knowledge about whether a certain group of people experience discrimination or obstacles that other groups might not face? Sometimes, at least, it does seem that knowledge does vary by the vantage point the knower occupies. Here's an example. Some school dress codes have come under fire recently for having length requirements to do with hair, and particularly ones that say that hair in the front of the face can't come down, let's say, below the eyebrows or cover the eyes at all. And curiously, these dress codes seem to disproportionately affect black boys. Why? If you are yourself black, you might already have a glimpse or guess of the answer, and it's to do with dreadlocks and braids. To put it bluntly, what we often call Afro-textured hair has a different texture than other hair. It's usually a bit harder to tame. It might require a bit more combing throughout the day so that it doesn't tangle. And because of this, dreadlocks and braids are a pretty common hairstyle choice for both males and females. For several reasons, dreads and braids are often grown out rather than cut frequently, and it's really hard to cut anything below a certain length without it sort of defeating the points of having the braids or dreads in the first place. For that reason, and maybe because black hairstyles are more conspicuous than other hairstyles, black students become more likely to be called out for a failure to meet these hair guidelines, especially when the guidelines apply to the front of the head, where hair can't grow below the forehead. Philosopher Charles Mills might call this an example of white ignorance, or as he puts it, the idea of an ignorance, a non-knowing that is not contingent, but in which race, white racism and or white racial domination and their ramifications, plays a crucial causal role. Now, this need not be as sinister and conniving as it sounds. Mills only means that there are certain things that, namely because of the historical racism we've all inherited, white people just don't need to think about certain things that black people are regularly privy to. Put it this way. I don't know the racial makeup of the school boards who create these hair length policies, but I have to imagine that if black people had been on these boards or been consulted about these decisions, the boards would have more likely recognized the possible problems and created different dress codes, even if they simply made dreads and braids subject to different hair requirements. A different example, and this time about autism. When an autistic friend and I were chatting, we brought up the idea that many scholars have that one mark of autism is an impaired ability to conceive of other humans as having minds. So the idea is that people with autism have a certain social impairment that comes from not being able to think about other people and their minds and figuring out how other people might think. My autistic friend insightfully said the following in response. It isn't that we don't have an idea about people's minds. We just assume, like you do, that others' minds work the way ours do. It isn't that we don't understand minds, it's that we understand our own minds and struggle to understand yours. But the fact that you're in the majority means that you think we just don't understand how minds work. More to the point about ignorance and asymmetrical information, he also went on to say that autistic people have to try to understand the neurotypical mind, but the neurotypical person will rarely, if ever, be expected to understand the autistic person's mind. Autistic people, a small numerical minority, must get inside the world of neurotypicals, but neurotypicals don't generally need to get inside the world of autistic people. So this gets us into the part about why and when knowledge could be called asymmetrical, why some people might have more knowledge in certain situations than others. Particularly when a group is in a minority, either numerically or in terms of cultural power, they often have to navigate the majority's world in a way that the majority will never or rarely have to navigate the minority's world. That often means that the minority group will have to know majority group ways more than the other way around. I grew up as a left-hander in a world of tools designed for right-handers, and quite often I had to learn how to use those tools in a way that right-handers never need to learn how to cut with left-handed scissors and things like that. Or, as the author and activist James Weldon noted, colored people in this country know and understand the white people better than white people know and understand them. As a final and more personal example, it wasn't until my family began the long-term fostering of a black child that we realized how hard it was to find books, dolls, toys, and other representations that represented children with dark skin, especially if we wanted those people being portrayed as just regular people. I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that that's not something I really thought about except in theory when our only child was our white son. It isn't that this knowledge somehow wasn't available to me, like we couldn't have noticed that the great majority of children's toys and books don't depict dark-skinned people. It's just we didn't need to notice. This type of ignorance is what philosopher Charles Mills would call passive ignorance. It isn't that school boards who create these dress codes don't want to know how their policies might affect marginalized communities. It's that such knowledge is something that people in predominantly white settings just don't need to think about, and it might not even occur to them to think about. But Mills also makes a point to talk about more active types of ignorance, where someone has the opportunity to know and finds a way of avoiding to do it. This he calls active ignorance. Here's an example. I've been in conversations where any mention of black people experiencing racial discrimination are dismissed by whoever I'm talking to. Those people, the speaker says, must have misinterpreted what was going on. Surely there's a better explanation. That might be true. But when other black people suggest that they've never experienced discrimination or it's always just trivial whenever they do, the same person who rushed to discredit claims of discrimination by some black people readily accept this new statement. This second group has it right, and surely they can't be misinterpreting what was going on the way the other group surely was. Yes, people can be wrong about their experiences and claims to knowledge. Just because someone occupies a different vantage point than yours doesn't mean that their take is the correct one, but just as surely it's hard to see, let alone admit, that differently situated others might have takes that are different from ours precisely because they perceive something that we're missing. So why is it hard to admit that our perspective may be limited and other people might have a different but legitimate take? First, we often want to think that the world is fair and just. Social scientists call this the just world hypothesis. And therefore, we may be more likely to treat claims of injustice more skeptically than we should. Second, it's a lot easier to assume, it feels better to assume, that the knowledge we have is just reflective of the way the world is, rather than to have to think that the knowledge we have is pretty perspective dependent and only reflects the way we've encountered the world rather than how others have. Third, for a lot of complex reasons, likely owing to our cultural inheritance, it often feels strange to admit that knowledge may come differently to different categories of people. Like I said earlier, we like to think of knowledge as vantage point neutral. Either it's accessible to all or it can't really be knowledge, and trivial things like skin color, sex, or gender just can't factor into what knowledge is available to a person. All of these reasons might lead us to discount knowledge claims of others when they don't align with our understanding of things, what we often take to be the neutral and true understanding of things. And to reiterate, we shouldn't always take what others tell us as true. Maybe the other is lying to us, misinterpreting evidence, or unreliable for some other reason. But if there's always a chance, and I would say a likelihood, that our view of things has significant blind spots, what should we do? How do we proceed? A favorite philosopher of mine, William James, puts it this way. Everyone is nevertheless prone to claim that his conclusions are the only logical ones, that they are necessities of universal reasons, they being all the while, at bottom, accidents more or less of personal vision, which had better be avowed as such. Maybe the best response to the possibility of ignorance is humility and openness. Admit partiality and always allow for the idea that others experience and interpret the world differently from you, and maybe their experiences are valid. Talk as much as you can to those different from yourself, and always at least entertain what they have to say with honesty and humility. Don't just dismiss different perspectives as obviously misguided, mistaken, etc. You may, of course, after all that, be right in your take, but you may also be wrong. And if you are wrong, the irony of human psychology is that you might be the least reliable person in the room to figure that out.